Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about another Android phone that came out a couple of years ago, and honestly this was one of the first Android phones. Actually, it wasn't the first Android phones, but it was a very good phone. And back in 2017, as I've said before with a lot of other Android phones, it's just like if you were to get this phone at that time, in my head it's just like how much better can a phone get? This phone is already beautiful, it feels so premium, it looks so good, and with the Galaxy S8 and the S8 Plus coming out at the same time, I was just thinking to myself that you wouldn't have to upgrade your phone forever because these phones will still be getting support because these phones just look so good. But obviously there's more that go into phones than this. But if you want to pick up an S8 Plus, I'll go ahead and find the cheapest one on Amazon, but I'll also, go ahead and link some other phones that I would also recommend this year. The cheapest, best valued ones that I'll also kind of hit on later on in this video. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the front of the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus, you have a 6.2-inch Super AMOLED display, and this is a 1440p panel. Now, what I can tell you about the front screen of this phone is that it is still extremely beautiful, it is still extremely relevant, and when I look at a phone like the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus's panel, and I even compare it to the Galaxy S20 or the S20 Plus, the 12 Pro Max, the OnePlus 8 Pro, those panels and this panel kind of fall in the same league. I think this panel is better than what we have in the Note 20, it's better than what we have on the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I think it's probably better than the OnePlus 8 Pro, but the biggest differentiating factor here is that we don't have a 120Hz on this specific panel, which is okay. This phone came out almost 4 years ago, so it's totally understandable, but that's the biggest improvement that I think I've seen in the last year or two for the increase in refresh rate. But the panel of the S8 Plus is still really good, a little bit of bezel on the top and bottom, but it's still totally okay for the most part. On the bottom, you do have a USB Type-C port, as well as the headphone jack. You have the Samsung DeX experience on this device as well, so it's kind of like a desktop type thing, which when you plug it in, it's just super cool, and I love seeing that. You also have a micro SD card slot on this phone as well, and you have IP certification on this phone. So even though this phone came out, a couple years ago, it really isn't dated in terms of I/O, and especially when it comes down to storage expandability. I mean, that in and of itself is another huge aspect of this device. Now, on the back, you do have a glass back, which I actually do like. I like the frosted glass backs that we have nowadays, but I still think this type of glass back is more than good enough for a lot of people. You have a wireless charging on this phone as well. Now, on the top of this glass back, you do have that single camera setup as well as that fingerprint sensor right next to it, but we'll go ahead and hit on the camera setup right now. It has that single 12 megapixel sensor. You have optical image stabilization, which is great, and you have the ability of shooting 4K at 30 and 1080p at 60 and 720p at 240 if you want to do that. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but I will tell you, in this day and age, it is pretty important to have 4K at 60, and obviously we have 8K capability now, so it would be kind of cool how we had that capability on this device. But obviously, and I'm not talking about 8K, I'm talking about 4K at 60, but I still think 4K at 30 is perfectly fine. I mean, a lot of phones that were coming out at this time still only had 4K at 30, so that may be the only place where you may feel a little outdated, but a lot of people still use 1080p, so it's totally okay. Now, the features built into this camera, I think, are still pretty current, because when you have, portrait mode, you don't have portrait mode, but when you have all these other type of, accessories on this type of device, even though it's only a single camera setup, you still have a lot of features in the software. So I think that's a pretty big advantage when it comes down to it. So I don't think this camera is outdated because it's a single camera setup. You still have a lot of features built into, which is really great. So the front camera may be the biggest problem though, and I feel like this is just one area where I'm gonna have to kind of diss the S8 Plus as much as I don't want to. It has an 8 megapixel wide angle lens. It also has a 2 megapixel iris scanner, but I think that's only for, scanning your eyes and stuff. But with this 8 megapixel sensor, it can only shoot 1440p. I wish it did have, like 4K on the front, and even at 1440p it would be okay, but I just don't think the front camera of this thing is all that great. I think it looks kind of grainy for most photos. It's definitely not perfect, and I'm not expecting it to be perfect. I would expect it to be a little bit better at the long run, but I think at the end of the day, it's an okay camera setup on the front, but it's a pretty good, camera setup on the back. So the rear facing camera is actually pretty good for the most part. So in terms of the whole entire camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Now, hitting on the whole entire software experience of this type of phone, this is probably where it kind of messes up, probably more than anything else. It's not getting any more software updates. It stopped getting software updates at One UI 1. Had it gotten a little bit further, I think that would have been really cool. One UI 2 was a pretty big improvement because of that, overall gesture-based design. We do kind of have some capability of like that on One UI 1, but on One UI UI2, they really revamped it with the Galaxy S9 and S9 Plus. It's a far better experience. But with this phone, there's nothing we can really do about it. I think there are custom ROM capability for the Exynos versions, but on my Snapdragon versions, I don't have any, custom ROM capability, no rooting capability on these phones, which really makes me sad because these phones could have easily supported some really nice custom ROMs. And already they're outdated. I think they're getting security updates still, but for the most part, it's already outdated. So in terms of software, that pretty much covers it up. Now, performance-wise, this phone has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 chipset, an octa-core CPU, an Adreno 540 GPU, and 4 gigabytes of RAM on the base model, and then 6 gigs of RAM on the top-tier model. And what I can tell you about the performance of this phone is that it's still a pretty good performing phone for the most part. I would scale it maybe like a 7.5 to 8 out of 10 when you factor in the age of this phone and even like the price tag and all that, because it's not a slow performing phone by any means. First of all, for day-to-day tasks, if you're just opening apps and you're going to one app and the other and all that stuff, for the most part, it's going to be okay. The biggest problem may be in the RAM management nowadays, because when you have, 8 gigs of RAM on these new phones, if you're rocking the base model of the S8 Plus, you're definitely going to feel like you have somewhat of a slow phone in terms of, loading up apps and apps closing out in the background. But if you're not expecting the most in terms of the RAM management, I think the app opening speeds on this phone are still pretty good. And I think once you have the app open on the phone, that in and of itself is also another huge, good thing about this phone too, because I played a lot of games on the, Galaxy S8 Plus. I played a lot of apps and Temple Run and all this crazy stuff. Not crazy, those apps aren't crazy, but anytime I, played with this phone for the last couple of years that I owned it, it really hasn't been any issues. It's pretty much done everything I wanted to throw at it. And as I said before, this is another huge advantage of this type of device. When you have a phone like a Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus, you're not going to feel like you have an outdated phone. There are some areas where you are going to feel like it is a little bit dated. I think specifically in the RAM management, like I stated, but also when it comes down to the whole entire software experience, there's a lot of bogged downness that just comes down with Samsung's One UI. They still haven't perfected it. It's still, a huge problem in my opinion. But I will tell you, for the most part and for the time being, you're going to have a pretty fast phone. It's not going to be, faster than any phone that came out in the last 2 years. But like I said before, when you factor in the age and the price of this phone, it's really not that bad of an experience overall. So in terms of the performance, that pretty much covers it up. Now, hitting on the battery life, this phone had a pretty big 3500 mAh battery when it first came out. And I think it was the biggest battery on any Samsung phone at that time. I could be totally wrong. I think or at least on the Galaxy S series side, it was bigger. I don't think it was bigger than the Note series, but that's a pretty good size battery to have. You had wireless charging on it too, which is really cool. But I would say nowadays that's kind of like the average size battery, which is pretty funny. For the iPhone 12 Pro Max, that's about the size battery we have. On the Galaxy S20, I think it's about the same size as well. No reverse wireless charging or anything like that. And the batteries have degraded a little bit over time. But I think for the time being, this is still a pretty good, battery life for the most part. So when it comes down to that, I'll probably give this battery probably like, a 7 out of 10. Definitely not great. But like I said before, when you factor in the age and the price and all that good stuff, I'd probably rate it like a 7 out of 10. So to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, is the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus still worth it in 2021? Well, this is literally what I'll just break it down to, and I'll just give you some pros right off the top of my head. The panel of this phone is still beautiful. It's still a really, really good panel. It's 1440p. The resolution is pretty much the same thing as like the S20s and the OnePlus 8 Pros. This panel is so good still, and I think it's definitely one of its biggest assets. You have a little bit of bezel on the top and bottom, but it's really not that much to complain about. You have Samsung DeX on this phone as well, which is really awesome. You have a pretty decent back-facing camera. It's not great, but it's definitely okay. Like I said, I rate it like a 7 or 8 out of 10. You have a, back glass. The premiumness of this phone is beautiful. USB Type-C, headphone jack, micro SD card slot support, and the list goes on. I mean, and the performance isn't even that bad either. I think the performance is actually more of a pro than a con, but there are a few cons that may rub some people off the wrong way. First of all, I think the fingerprint sensor is located in a really weird location up there right by the camera. They did fix it with the S9, but still, I don't know what they were thinking. It's just kind of a weird place to put it. The front camera of this thing isn't really great looking either. It gets the job done, but it's definitely not perfect by any means. And even in today's standards, even in that standard of that day and age, it's really not that great if I'm being honest. The software is probably the biggest problem of all of these things though. The software, I mean, is totally outdated. There's no custom ROM capability. There's no, I think it's getting security updates like I stated, but because the software is what it is, it really does hinder a lot of what this phone could be and what it could have been. Had it gotten One UI 2, I think that would have been really cool with the gesture-based design on this phone, but we don't have it, so we're already kind of outdated there. And you can't even custom ROM this thing. You can't root it for the most part unless you have the Exynos version, so you're already kind of outdated, and you're kind of stuck, you know? Like, you can't really do much of this phone without those capabilities. You can still do a lot, don't get me wrong, but you're already outdated when it comes down to the features, so that does kind of suck. But I will tell you, with those things being said, I think this phone is still pretty good for the most part. Like, if you can pick one up and if you just need a phone for like the next 6 months or so, this is still a really, really good phone. Now, if you want a good long-term phone, I think the Galaxy S10 is just the way to go, either the S10 or the S10e. Those are beautiful phones, and those are going to be getting software support for a pretty long time too, much longer than this thing. So that's a really good, alternative. And I don't really think there's a lot of other phones besides those two. So I'm also going to leave a Samsung Galaxy S10 and a Galaxy S10e link down in the description. You can get all these phones from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.